I never thought I'd have to explain to two sheriff's deputies that the woman standing in front of them with a dusty pickup full of boxes wasn't trespassing. She was simply trying to move into her own house. But that's exactly how one of the strangest days of my life started. And by the time the sun went down, the people who tried to throw me out had watched the organization they used to control disappear right in front of them. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, and for almost 12 years I've worked as a respiratory therapist in Spokane, Washington, which means I've spent enough nights watching people fight for another breath that I don't waste much energy arguing with petty people. Usually. The cabin sat about 90 minutes outside the city, tucked between tall pines and a creek that my grandmother Eleanor used to call the only honest neighbor she ever had because, according to her, water always went where the truth was. When she passed away, she left me that cabin in her will. At least, that's what everyone believed. Even I believed it. She was never the sentimental type. She didn't hug much, didn't tell long stories, didn't give advice unless someone asked twice. But every birthday, she mailed me a handwritten card with $20 folded inside and one sentence that always made me laugh. Keep your paperwork safer than your feelings. At the time, I thought it was just another one of Grandma Eleanor's odd sayings. Looking back now, I realized she knew exactly what she was doing. The morning I drove up there, my truck was packed with clothes, books, an old coffee table my dad built 30 years ago, and a sleepy golden retriever named Murphy who snored louder than the engine. I had a 12-hour shift starting later that afternoon, so the plan was simple: unload enough to spend the night, drive back to work, then slowly settle in over the next few weeks. Life, however, seemed to have its own entertainment planned. As I rounded the final bend, I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. The gate leading into the private road was chained shut. Not locked the way I remembered from years ago, but wrapped in a brand new heavy chain with a bright yellow padlock hanging from it like some kind of trophy. Murphy lifted his head and stared through the windshield while I sat there wondering if maybe the county had closed the road for repairs. Then a black SUV rolled out from behind a cluster of cedar trees. The driver stepped out slowly, wearing cargo pants, polished boots, mirrored sunglasses, and one of those tactical vests that makes a middle-aged man look like he desperately wants strangers to think he's still in charge of something. He walked toward my truck with the confidence of someone expecting applause. "Morning," he said without smiling. "You lost." I rolled my window down. "Actually, I'm moving in." He glanced into the truck, then back at me. "Not without authorization, you're not." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. Authorization from who? He pointed at a small sign nailed to a fence post that read Cedar Hollow Community Association. "From us." I reached into my folder and handed him a copy of the recorded deed. "I inherited the cabin. My name's right there." He barely looked at it before folding his arms. "Ownership doesn't exempt you from community regulations. You need a move-in approval packet, a security inspection, and payment of the relocation assessment." I blinked. I've lived in apartments with less paperwork than adopting a dog. He didn't laugh. "Rules are rules." "Okay," I said, trying to stay polite. "Where do I get this packet?" "You should have applied 30 days ago. I only got probate finalized last week." "Then that's your problem." Murphy barked once from the back seat, as if even he thought this conversation was ridiculous. I took a breath and checked my watch. Every minute mattered. "Sir, I'm due at the hospital this afternoon. I just need to unload a few things." He leaned closer to the window. "No permit, no entry." His tone wasn't loud, but it had that practiced arrogance that comes from years of people backing down. "What's your name?" I asked. "Douglas Kane, Director of Community Compliance." Community Compliance. It sounded less like a neighborhood position and more like a title someone invented after watching too many action movies. I tried one more time. "Mr. Kane, with all due respect, this is my property." He looked me directly in the eyes and replied, "Maybe on paper. Around here, paper isn't what keeps order." Before I could answer, he pulled out his phone. "Who are you calling?" "Sheriff's office." "For what?" "Suspicious trespassing." I stared at him, honestly waiting for the punchline that never came. He dialed, calmly gave the address, described me as an unauthorized individual attempting to access restricted property, and even mentioned that I appeared unwilling to comply with community directives. I could actually hear the dispatcher asking questions through the speaker. When he hung up, He smiled for the first time. Now we wait. I looked out at the trees, then at the cabin roof barely visible beyond the gate, and for a second I heard my grandmother's voice from years ago while we sat on that porch drinking iced tea. She had tapped an old metal file box beside her rocking chair and said, "People spend too much time protecting fences and not enough time protecting documents." Back then, I thought she was talking about insurance. Standing there that morning, with a stranger trying to keep me away from my own front door, I suddenly wondered whether she had meant something much bigger. And without realizing it, I reached down toward the worn leather folder still sitting beside my seat. The same folder she insisted I never throw away. Because somewhere inside it might be the reason she was never afraid of people like Douglas Kane. I pulled the leather folder onto my lap while Douglas stood a few yards away with his arms crossed, looking as satisfied as a man who believed he'd already won an argument that hadn't even finished yet. The folder smelled like old paper and cedar wood, exactly the way my grandmother's living room always had, and tucked behind the deed was an envelope with her handwriting across the front that simply read, "If people start acting important, read this first." I almost laughed because that sounded exactly like her, but my hands were shaking enough that I had to steady them against the steering wheel before opening it. Inside was a collection of survey maps, tax records, and several folded documents from the county recorder's office. At first, none of it made much sense. Parcel numbers, acreage calculations, legal descriptions that seemed written in a language only surveyors and attorneys could understand. Then I noticed that 4 of the maps shared the same last name. Mitchell, my last name. My grandmother hadn't only left me the cabin. She had left me 4 neighboring parcels that stretched behind the tree line and wrapped around part of the private road leading into the community. I spread the maps across the passenger seat, grabbed my phone calculator, and started adding acreage while Murphy stared at me with his head tilted as if he knew something I didn't. 22 acres, then 11, then 9, then another 18, plus the cabin lot itself. I looked back toward the entrance sign, where Cedar Hollow Community Association was proudly painted in dark green letters, and suddenly realized something that made my heartbeat slow instead of speed up. Douglas noticed the change in my expression. "Figured out you're not getting in today?" he asked. "Actually," I said quietly, "I'm figuring something else out." He chuckled. People always think they can outsmart paperwork. If only he knew that paperwork was exactly what was about to ruin his morning. I called my attorney, Melissa Grant, a woman who had represented my family years before in a property boundary issue. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Lauren, everything okay?" "Maybe. Maybe not. I need you to listen carefully because I think I just found something strange." I explained the situation while reading parcel numbers as quickly as I could. There was silence for several seconds. Then I heard keyboard clicks. More silence. Finally, she said, "Don't hang up." Another minute passed before she came back. "Lauren, do you have the original community charter anywhere?" I searched the folder again and found a photocopy with faded blue ink. "Yes." Turned to Article 8. I unfolded the page and started reading. Most of it was routine language about maintenance, dues, and voting rights until my eyes landed on one paragraph. Melissa interrupted before I could finish. "Read the second sentence out loud." I did. It stated that voting authority would be proportionate to total acreage represented within the association boundaries. "Now," she said calmly, "tell me your acreage total." I gave her the number. She typed again. "Lauren." She paused long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You control more than 60% of the association's represented land." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the board has been acting like it governs you, when legally it exists because owners like you allow it to exist." I looked through the windshield at Douglas, who was now chatting casually with someone inside the black SUV. "You're telling me?" "I'm telling you not to argue with him anymore. Put me on speaker when law enforcement arrives." The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the valley before I could answer. 2 sheriff's vehicles rolled to a stop behind my truck. Deputies stepped out, one older with gray hair, the other younger and carrying a small notebook. Douglas walked toward them with remarkable confidence. His body language changed completely. He shook hands, pointed toward me, gestured toward the gate, and I could almost imagine the story he was telling. The younger deputy approached my window. Ma'am, we've received a complaint regarding unauthorized access. I handed him my driver's license and the deed. I'm trying to move into my own property. Douglas interrupted from behind him. She refuses to comply with community regulations and is creating a disturbance. Creating a disturbance? I repeated. I've been sitting in my truck talking to my dog. The older deputy held up a hand. Let's slow this down. Melissa's voice came through the phone. Deputy, my name is Melissa Grant, attorney for Ms. Mitchell. If you don't mind, I'd like everyone to hear something before any decisions are made. Douglas smirked. An attorney can't rewrite community rules over a phone call. Melissa ignored him. Please ask Mr. Kane whether Cedar Hollow's governing charter from its original filing remains in effect. The deputy turned. Is that correct? Douglas shrugged. As far as I know. Excellent, Melissa replied. Then Article 8 remains controlling. My client owns a majority of represented acreage based on recorded county parcels inherited from Eleanor Mitchell. She possesses controlling voting authority under the original charter. Douglas laughed loudly. That's ridiculous. Melissa continued without raising her voice. Furthermore, under Article 12, any amendment or dissolution supported by a controlling majority of represented acreage is effective immediately upon proper declaration. Even the birds seemed to stop making noise. The older deputy took the phone from me with permission and listened while Melissa cited recording numbers and filing dates. Then he asked to see the survey maps. We spread everything across the hood of his vehicle. Douglas stepped closer, trying to point out sections that supposedly didn't count, but every time he spoke, Melissa calmly referenced another document. Finally, the deputy looked at his partner and said, Let's verify the acreage. The younger deputy pulled out his tablet and accessed county records. The minutes felt endless. Douglas kept pacing. At one point, he muttered, There's no way an old woman owned that much land. I quietly answered, maybe because nobody bothered asking. The younger deputy finally looked up. The parcels match. The older deputy folded his arms, not aggressively, but professionally, then faced Douglas. Based on the documents presented, we don't have grounds to remove Ms. Mitchell from property she legally owns. Douglas's confidence cracked for the first time. You're just going to let her ignore community authority? The deputy answered, Community authority doesn't override recorded ownership. Then he turned to me. Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. He actually reached out and shook my hand. I wish I could say I celebrated in that moment, but honestly, I mostly felt exhausted. I had come to unload furniture, not dismantle someone's ego. Douglas, however, wasn't finished. He pointed at me and said, This isn't over. The board will stop this. Melissa's voice returned through the speaker. Then perhaps the board should prepare for a meeting. A meeting? Douglas snapped. Yes, she replied, because my client intends to exercise every voting right granted under the governing documents. I stared toward the cabin beyond the gate, the porch where my grandmother used to shell peas in the summer while waving at passing neighbors, and I suddenly realized she had never fought these people publicly because she never needed to. She had simply waited, organized every record, paid every fee, and left the entire chessboard to someone who would eventually have no choice but to make the next move. As the deputies drove away and Douglas stood speechless beside the chain he had locked with such confidence only an hour earlier, Melissa said one final sentence that stayed with me the entire drive to town. Lauren, don't confuse revenge with accountability. Revenge feels good for a day. Accountability changes things for years. So before you decide what to do next, decide whether you're trying to win an argument or end a system. And sitting at the first red light on the highway with Murphy asleep again in the passenger seat and my grandmother's old folder resting beside him, I realized the answer had already been waiting for me inside those papers all along. Because 72 hours later, nearly every homeowner in Cedar Hollow would receive a certified notice that none of them expected to see. And the meeting described in that letter would become the most expensive afternoon in the history of their little community. 72 hours later, the community clubhouse looked less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom where nobody knew who the judge was supposed to be. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking lot. People stood outside whispering in small circles, And every time I walked past someone, the conversation stopped just long enough for them to watch me before pretending they had been discussing the weather. Murphy stayed in the truck with the windows cracked and his favorite blanket, while I carried the same leather folder my grandmother had protected for years. Inside the building, the board members sat at a long table, wearing expressions that ranged from irritated to nervous. Douglas Kane was there too, dressed in a pressed polo shirt instead of tactical gear, which somehow made him look even less confident. The association attorney shuffled papers without making eye contact with anyone. The meeting itself had cost thousands of dollars to organize on short notice because the bylaws required legal notice, recording services, and administrative procedures, and several people complained before it even started. One homeowner stood up and said, "Why are we paying for this?" Another answered, "Because somebody decided to call the sheriff instead of reading the county records." The room fell quiet. I didn't smile. There was no point. The board president finally cleared his throat and announced the purpose of the emergency session. He tried to sound formal, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Melissa sat beside me and whispered, "Just tell the truth. Documents do the arguing." When my turn came, I walked to the front carrying a map that unfolded across nearly the entire table. I pointed to the cabin first because everyone recognized it, then traced the property lines beyond the trees, across the creek, around the access road, and over the neighboring parcels. You could actually hear chairs moving as people leaned forward. One older couple exchanged confused looks. A younger man muttered, "I had no idea those lots belonged to the same family." Melissa presented certified copies from the county recorder, tax histories, survey maps, and the original governing charter. Every exhibit supported the next one until the entire picture became impossible to ignore. Douglas finally stood up. "This is a technicality. The association has operated for years under existing practice." Melissa answered calmly, "Practice does not erase recorded authority." He turned toward the room. "You can't let one person destroy the community." Before I could respond, an elderly woman in the second row raised her hand. "Then why did you tell everyone she was trespassing?" Douglas hesitated. "Because she failed to comply with procedure." The woman frowned. "Procedure isn't ownership." Another homeowner spoke up. "Did you really call law enforcement before checking the deed?" No answer. The silence became heavier than any argument. The association attorney quietly adjusted his glasses and said something I don't think Douglas expected to hear. "Based on the governing documents and verified ownership percentages, Ms. Mitchell possesses controlling voting authority under the current charter." It felt as though all the air left the room at once. Melissa nodded toward me. "Whenever you're ready." I looked around at faces that were angry, embarrassed, curious, and in a few cases relieved. Then I thought about my grandmother sitting on that porch, writing checks every year without complaining, filing every receipt, preserving every survey map. She had never taught me to yell louder than other people. She taught me to know what belonged to me. I took a slow breath. I moved that Cedar Hollow Community Association be dissolved effective immediately pursuant to the authority granted under Article 12 of the governing charter. Someone whispered she wouldn't actually do it. Melissa slid the voting record toward me. My controlling interest exceeded the threshold required. I vote yes. The board president looked helplessly at the attorney. The attorney gave a small nod. The motion carries. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. It was almost stranger than that. The room simply sat there in stunned silence, while years of assumed authority vanished because the documents had always said something different from what people believed. Douglas stared at the table for several seconds before gathering his papers with jerky movements. As he walked past me, he stopped and said quietly, "You enjoyed this." I met his eyes and answered no. I would have enjoyed unloading my truck 3 days ago. He didn't reply. He just kept walking until the clubhouse door closed behind him. I thought the story ended there, but my grandmother apparently believed in finishing every chapter completely. While reviewing financial records, Melissa discovered 6 years of fees and assessments that had been collected from my grandmother under questionable interpretations of association rules. We requested a formal accounting. The numbers kept growing. Annual assessments, special assessments, administrative charges, transfer preparation costs, inspection fees that nobody could explain. The total surprised even the accountant reviewing them. The association's remaining funds were largely consumed satisfying obligations and reimbursements that should have been addressed years earlier. Within days, the reserve account that everyone assumed would always be there had been reduced to almost nothing. Some residents blamed me. Others blamed the board. A few admitted they had ignored warning signs because they thought questioning authority would make life harder. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin after another long hospital shift. The chain was gone. The oversized warning signs had disappeared. Wildflowers were growing along the edge of the driveway, where tires no longer cut into the dirt every day. I carried a mug of coffee onto the porch just before sunrise and listened to the creek moving over the rocks. Murphy stretched out beside the steps and sighed like an old man who had finally found the perfect place to nap. I reached into the leather folder one last time and found the birthday card my grandmother had mailed years before. The $20 bill was still folded inside. Underneath her familiar handwriting were the words I somehow never paid attention to until then. People who depend on power hope nobody reads the fine print. I smiled, folded the card, and slipped it back into the folder because some lessons deserve to stay exactly where they were found. Now, whenever friends ask whether I regret what happened, I tell them the truth. I never wanted to defeat a neighborhood. I wanted to unlock a gate. Everything that happened after that was simply the consequence of people confusing control with ownership and intimidation with law. But here's the question I still think about, and I'd love to hear what you think. If you discovered that a community organization had been abusing its authority for years, would you have dissolved at the moment you had the legal right? Or would you have tried to reform it instead? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this are never just about property. They're about power, fairness, and the moment ordinary people decide they're no longer willing to be pushed around.